You can go ahead.
Amy Mullis will never get to see her kids graduate from high school. She won't be there when they go off to college, and she won't be there when they get married, because her life ended when she was brutally and viciously attacked with a corn rake on November 10th, 2018. Amy Mullis didn't stand a chance. She was unarmed and unaware that she was about to be ambushed by the very man that took a vow to love and honor her, the defendant. Amy Mullis would still be alive today if it weren't for the actions of her husband. She started that day like any other day, working on a puzzle, making breakfast for her family, and doing some chores on the farm. She didn't know that was the day that the defendant was going to seize his opportunity. He was going to attack her in the back with a corn rake and try to make it look like an accident. Amy Mullis is not here to tell her story. The defendant made sure of that when he turned Amy from a beautiful and vibrant 39-year-old woman into this, a state medical examiner number. When you go back to the jury room, you have 3 tools to aid you in your deliberation. The first is the facts. That's the evidence and the testimony that came from this witness stand. The second tool to aid in your deliberation is the law. And Judge Bitter just started reading a lot of the law to you, and he's going to read a little bit more to you when we're done here, and I'm also going to go over some of it. And the third tool that you get to take back there with you is your common sense. Your collective common sense that comes from your everyday life experiences. Ask yourself what makes sense. You'll then see, when you use your common sense and apply it to the law and the facts, that the only verdict supported by both the law and the evidence is that the defendant is guilty of first-degree murder. Now, as jurors, you have a duty. You all got sworn in on either Monday afternoon or Tuesday, and you all took an oath. And you have a duty, your sole duty, is to find the truth and do justice. And the state has the burden of proof, as the judge just read to you, and we talked about in jury selection. And we only have to prove the elements of the crime charged. The state must prove all of the following elements of murder in the first degree. First, on or about the 10th day of November 2018, the defendant committed an act upon Amy Mullis. Second, Amy Mullis died as a result of the act by the defendant. Third, the defendant acted with malice aforethought. And fourth, the defendant acted willfully, deliberately, premeditatedly, and with specific intent to kill Amy Mullis. So let's talk about the first proposition. On or about the 10th day of November 2018, the defendant committed an act upon Amy Mullis. The act is the striking of the corn, taking this corn rake and striking Amy Mullis with it. There is absolutely no controverted testimony that Amy Mullis was struck with this corn rake on November 10th, 2018. We know Amy was struck at least 2 or 3 times. We know she had other injuries on the front of her body, and that corn rake was impaled in her back. We know that's the act. And how do we know the defendant committed the act? Like I said to you before, one of the most important things is the facts and the evidence that came from this witness stand. We know that back in November 2018, Amy is scared of the defendant. She is planning on leaving the defendant. He is the only person who has the motive to kill Amy. And we know that. We know he has motive because of the affair that Amy is having. The defendant can come up here and tell you that he thought that affair was over. He didn't care. Everything was hunky-dory. You know he's not telling you the truth. You are the judges. You are to determine the credibility of the witness. You are to look at the demeanor and the credibility of the witnesses when they testify. Look at that in light of all the other evidence and ask yourself if that makes sense. Amy is telling all of her friends and family how she's afraid of the defendant. She's afraid that if he finds out she's having an affair, he's going to kill her or make her disappear. You heard from the defendant's own mouth, and you've heard from everybody else in this case, nobody else had the motive to kill Amy. The defendant knew about that affair, and we know the defendant didn't want Amy to get half of his farm. And we know that from two people, because he told Eileen Fuller that, and he told Terry Stainer that. He told them, well, I can't let her take half of my farm. He wasn't going to let Amy get half of his farm or try to take away his kids from him. The defendant is the only one that had the opportunity to do this. He waits until Amy has this procedure, this very simple procedure, so that he can use that as an excuse. Don't let him fool you. What about the text that day? Carrie Callan's text. Carrie Callan texts Amy and asks, how are things going? I'm worried about you, because she hasn't heard from her in a few days, or a couple weeks actually. And she writes back, okay, things are kind of tense around here. I don't know what's going to happen. That's at 8 in the morning. We know at 10:14 in the morning, Amy is then emailing Jerry Frazier saying she doesn't really want to, but she's going to go out and do some chores on the barn. And then at noon, at 12:01, there's a 911 call that Amy has been impaled with a corn rake. She was telling Carrie how things were tense that day. On that day, the defendant isolates Amy by sending her to the shed. If the defendant wants you to really believe that there is some mystery attacker out there, how would this person know Amy was going to the shed? How? How would they know? Because according to the defendant, it's at that moment that he just says, oh, you know what you can do for me? You can go and get that pet carrier. And not only that, is there somebody waiting there, hoping that there's a murder weapon there? Because he told you that corn rake was in there. So you would have to believe that there's a mystery attacker just standing out there, hoping that somehow Amy gets isolated, and then also hoping, oh wait, I hope there's also a weapon in there so I can kill her. It doesn't make any sense. We know no one else is on the farm. Tristan tells us that, and the defendant tells us that. Doesn't hear anything, doesn't see anything, never tells the police that there's anybody else, because there's no one else on the farm that day. Because the defendant did this and no one else did it. Also, the defendant tells you he doesn't hear a thing. If you want to believe the defendant's story, let's give him that. Let's for a second say, okay, somebody comes and does this. He wouldn't hear anything with the way Amy fought? With Amy going down like that? Getting swung with this corn rake in her back 2 or 3 times? The defendant sends Tristan to the shed, sending his 13-year-old son to go and find his mother. He doesn't call 911 right away because he's a doer, and he pulls that rake out of Amy right away. The defendant acts like it's an accident. Think about the defendant's actions, what he did after, telling everybody, implying that this is an accident. He even told you today, well, yeah, for 6 days until I was told it was a homicide, I thought it was an accident. Does that make sense? Even if he believes that day, fine. Again, let's give him that. That day, he thinks it's an accident because he just can't think of anything else. She must have fallen on a corn rake. The next day when he starts thinking about it and thinks she's face down with a corn rake sticking out of her back, oh, he's still gonna think it's an accident? No, because he's hoping that nothing comes of it. But the police and the medical examiners and the doctors realize what actually happened. It wasn't an accident, it was a homicide. The defendant's 911 call. First, listen to the contents of the 911 call. When you hear the defendant first say, oh yeah, I sent my son to the shed to go, he says, I sent my son to go find my wife. He also tells you she fell on a corn rake. Not, I don't know what happened. I have no idea. He's already telling his story. And I know today you heard some evidence about those whispers on that 911 call. And I'm going to implore you to listen to that 911 call. Don't take my word for it. Don't take the defense attorney's word for it. Because as the judge just told you, what we say is not evidence. Don't believe me. Listen to it for yourself. Make your own determination. That 911 call, there's two parts to it on State's Exhibit number 2. The first part is about 1 minute and 30 seconds. The second part is, I think, 7.5 or 8 minutes. If you go to that second part and you listen at 6:53, you can hear the defendant whisper, cheating whore. And if you go at 7.00, you can hear, go to hell, cheating whore. Listen to that 911 call. Make the decision for yourselves, and you will know, or you will see that you hear that. Let's also talk about the defendant's actions after. I already started touching on that, but what he starts telling everybody that this is an accident, about when he speaks with Luke Thompson and John LeClaire, the deputies that day, indicating it's an accident, not telling them anything about the cameras, because now he remembers, well, he thought of it the next day. And the Google searches. I'm not going to go over every single Google search with you because I know you've heard lots of different evidence. It doesn't matter what time those Google searches are. What matters is the content of them. And yes, I'm sure some of those searches and those records Amy did make, and maybe the kids did too, but you can bet that none of them looked for killing unfaithful women. It just so happens she's having an affair, and he's not the one looking for killing unfaithful women. Organs of the body. It just so happens that he looks for organs of the body, and 4 days later she's stabbed in her organs with a corn rake. What happened to cheating spouses in ancient historic Aztec tribes? Did ancient cultures kill adulterers? Punishment is 18 months for killing cheating wife. You are allowed to consider this because it shows that the defendant is planning this for a very long time. He's thinking about what he's going to do. Now, I know that you're probably wondering, should we believe Tristan? And let's talk about Tristan. He's a 13-year-old boy who will probably never be in a situation like this ever again, I hope. Who will never be through or be a part of something so traumatic. He finds his mother with a corn rake sticking out of her back. He yells for his dad. He goes and gets the truck. The defendant puts her bleeding body on top of his as she's unresponsive. He later finds out she died. Think about that. And you know what? You can't blame Tristan, can you? He lost his mom that day. He doesn't want to lose his dad either. He's trying to protect his dad. But when you heard the testimony and the different things he said, it makes sense. That day, when he's first interviewed by the police, he says, yep, I'm with dad the whole time. Then when he does a deposition, he says, well, I wasn't with him for like 1.5 minutes or so. And then right after that deposition, he corrects it and says, well, I don't know how much time. And then when he testifies in court by way of closed circuit TV, again, he will not commit to a time because he doesn't know how much time his dad is out of his sight. He's protecting his dad. And ask yourself why. Why is his story changing? Why every time is he adding a little bit more time? Do you think he's coming to truth or coming to terms with the truth? The fact that he's accepting that his father killed his mother? He knows nobody else was on that farm that day. Both him and the defendant told you. It's the two of them, it's Amy, and it's the kids inside. We have proven the first element that on that date the defendant committed an act upon Amy Mullis. The second proposition is that Amy Mullis died as a result of the act by the defendant. You heard from both Dr. Thompson and Dr. Cruz. Amy died as a result of her injuries, those 6 puncture wounds on her body. They entered, I believe she said 4 of them entered the chest cavity and were fatal. The cause of death was sharp force injuries, and the manner of death was homicide. So we have proven that proposition. The third, the defendant acted with malice aforethought. And this is the first state of mind element. And there's a definition that the judge just read to you. Malice state of mind, which leads one to intentionally do a wrongful act to the injury of another in disregard of the rights of another out of actual hatred or with an evil or unlawful purpose. Malice may be established by evidence of actual hatred or by proof of a deliberate or fixed intent to do injury, fixed purpose or design to do some physical harm to another which exists before the act is committed. It does not have to exist for any particular length of time. So essentially, this state of mind element talks about that it has to have some type of disregard for the rights of another out of actual hatred or with an evil or unlawful purpose. And we have both here. At that point, the defendant does hate Amy. He hates her for cheating on him again, for having that affair, because she's going to leave him and try to take away the farm. You know this based on everything. Those Google searches in and of themselves show how much hatred he has to her. He's plotting her death, looking up ways to kill her. And even if you look at the second part of that, or with an evil or unlawful purpose, what purpose do you have other than to do some type of intent to do injury when you take this corn rake and you stab someone with it? As that last part says, it doesn't have to exist for any particular length of time. We have proven here that the defendant did plan this, but that time period, that begins the minute the defendant picks up that corn rake and decides to do that act. There's no amount of time that he has to act. We have to actually prove that he planned this. But we know he did. We know it from everything. We know it from all the evidence that you've heard. We know that the defendant acted with malice aforethought based on the injuries. The blunt force trauma on Amy's the front of her body and the puncture wounds, which are the sharp force injuries. This attack, this murder, was systematic and deliberate. Think about it. Think about the hatred, the intent to do injury that you must have when you take this and you swing it and strike somebody, stabbing them in the back. Not once, twice, and possibly 3 times. The force to which he had to have stabbed her body to go through, to puncture her breast implant, to go through those organs in that chest cavity. And not only did he stab her with it, he had to take it out and do it again. He is acting with malice aforethought. It does not take that much time to do that, and he was able to do it and get back to the barn to start the cover-up. We have proven the third element, that the defendant acted with malice aforethought. And the fourth element is that the defendant acted willfully, deliberately, premeditatedly, and with specific intent to kill Amy Mullis. And there's some definitions with regards to this second state of mind element. Willful means intentional or by fixed design or purpose and not accidental. To deliberate is to weigh in one's mind, to consider, to contemplate, or to reflect. Premeditate is to think or ponder upon a matter before acting. Deliberation and premeditation need not exist for any particular length of time before they act. This specific intent means not only being aware of doing an act and doing it voluntarily, but in addition, doing it with a specific purpose in mind. This is generally seldom capable of direct proof, and you have to consider all the facts and evidence surrounding the act to determine the defendant's specific intent. There is no other intent other than to kill when you take this corn rake and you stab somebody with it. It's that simple. There's also an inference, a dangerous weapons inference. If a person has the opportunity to deliberate and uses a dangerous weapon against another, resulting in death, you may, but are not required to, infer that the weapon was used with malice, premeditation, and specific intent to kill. We've also proven that fourth proposition. Based on all of the evidence, the defendant clearly deliberated, was acting willfully, deliberately, and premeditatedly. We know that. We know he had a specific intent to kill Amy. We know that based on the Google searches. We know that based on the fact that he decided to commit this crime at the exact moment that he did, waiting until she had this simple procedure so he can talk about how dizzy she was, isolating her to the shed, finding a way to get her away from Tristan so that he could commit this act, and then start the cover-up. The defendant's intent was very clear that day. Based on the facts and the evidence, and based on the inference, we know that we have proven that fourth proposition. You now know how this nightmare for Amy began. It happened 5 years ago when the defendant started controlling Amy, making her quit work, making her shop at Goodwill, watching her every move. He was already starting to contemplate after that first affair what he was going to do with her. Those first Google searches go back to December 25th, 2017, when things, according to the defendant, were going great. They were super open. That first search in 2017 is killing more accepted centuries ago. Then in January 2018, what did ancient cultures do to infidelity? This is even before she starts the affair with Jerry Frazier. Then they go on, January 21st, 2018, 16 facts or characteristics about cheating women. May 10th, 2018, looking at the punishment for a husband that kills a cheating wife. The defendant even was thinking about killing Amy before the second affair. And then it just continued. He continued the searches. He's confronting them. He's talking to her friends about these rumors, and he wants you to believe that that affair is over. He's not telling you the truth, just like he didn't tell John Turbot the truth that day, when he didn't initially even tell John Turbot about that affair. If he had nothing to hide, why wouldn't he have told him? He didn't want to give motive. He didn't want them to think that there's any reason he could have done this. The defendant tried to paint this picture to the police that things were perfect. He tried to do that with you too. Things were so great. Yet Amy is terrified for her life. She's telling her friends that she's afraid he's going to kill her, that he might make her disappear. She's making plans to divorce him. She's asking her brother to keep furniture so that she can leave him. Calling Deborah Sherbring, who she barely knows. Deb Sherbring told you she's probably seen Amy once in 5 years. Calling her hysterical. You've got to stop these rumors. If Todd finds out about them, he's going to kill me. She didn't even know. She starts talking about Tristan. Deb doesn't even know who Tristan is. She's not making this up. That doesn't sound like somebody who's happy in their marriage. That doesn't sound like somebody who's so open with what's going on. Even then, the defendant was planning. It's his cold and calculated plan, like I told you in opening. He started acting like super dad. He all of a sudden got really close to Tristan. He's hanging out with the kids more. All part of his plan. Think about it. This is a big deal. He was going to kill his wife and try to make it look like an accident. He was planning it for months. The Google searches, waiting for her to have this procedure. On November 10th, 2018, the defendant turned their home into a murder scene. The nightmare continued. It didn't just start back when the defendant started these searches or on the day that he killed Amy, because then it continued. The nightmare continued for Amy's family, for her children, for her friends and loved ones. And why? Why did he kill Amy? Because he didn't want to lose his farm? Because she was cheating? You might not like that Amy was having an affair, but that doesn't mean she deserved to die. And does the defendant think he gets to decide who lives and dies? Does he think he's above the law? He thinks the laws in Iowa don't apply to him? Today's the day you tell him the laws in the state of Iowa do apply to the defendant. Tell him he's not above the law. The defendant thought he silenced Amy's voice on November 10th, 2018. But this week, Amy's voice was heard here in this courtroom. Through the witnesses, through the evidence, Amy's voice was screaming through this courtroom this week, showing you that the defendant did this, pointing all the evidence towards the defendant, showing you he committed this brutal, senseless, and vicious murder. Today, this nightmare finally ends. It finally ends for Amy and for her friends and family, for her children, because Amy finally gets the justice she deserves. Today is the day you find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree.
Mr. Firehelm, whenever you're ready. I'll start out by commenting or making the point that this is my only opportunity to talk to you. The state's going to get up afterwards and have their last argument or statement to you. So we don't get to go back and forth all afternoon. Excuse me. So I suspect that not only will the state disagree with some of the things I have to say, but maybe make other points that they believe are relevant. So I'm going to try to be as complete as I can because this is my only opportunity. So please bear with me. When we came in here on Monday and you were picked as our jury, we had opening statements to you. And I went back last night and looked at my notes about that. And what the state, and these are my notes, and I think the state would agree with me, we don't try to deliberately mislead you. During these trials, we're scribbling notes and taking down what we later have to rely on. So I'm not going to deliberately try to mislead you, but I believe, to the best of my ability, these are the notes. Amy not happy, prior affair. Todd confronts Jerry and his wife in July. Her denial is not enough for Todd. The affair continues. She makes all these statements to her friends. And then a cold and calculated plan as set forth today. He tried to think of everything, they say. Only people at the farm, Amy and the kids. Get her outside, get her separated. Send her to the shed. Claim that the corn rake is an accidental fall. Go back to the barn where Tristan's at. Send Tristan to find her. Act upset. Call 911. Tell them that she fell. Then doctors, lawyers, law enforcement don't buy it. Amy told friends, he'll kill me. The iPad searches, plan to kill, evidence overwhelming. I then looked at my notes and what I suggested to you when we started this trial. And basically, I'm not going to repeat all those steps, but it really was what Todd Mullis told you from the stand yesterday about specifically that day, November 10th, 2018. The morning, going to the other farm, coming back, going to the hog barn, doing the chores out there that they had planned to do. All that, I believe, was consistently presented to you from the witness stand. Not only by Todd, but by Tristan, too. The state talks about Tristan that at first he said, I was with Dad all the time. Then it was, I was not with him for maybe a minute and a half. And then the other day on the video testimony, he said, well, I don't know. But remember what he and I talked about after he said, I don't know what the time was. I said, okay, what did you do when you stepped out of the main part of the hog barn and were not in eye contact with Todd? And you remember what he said? I got a drink of water. And I think I did it twice. Any other absences? Nope. So The time that you were out of eye contact with your dad is the amount of time that would take 2 drinks of water out of a hose just a few feet away from the door to the hog barn. Now, you saw photographs, and we'll look at them in a few minutes, of how big that barn is and where the entrances and exits are. So the state would want you to believe, apparently, is that Todd went to the other end of the barn and out a door and ran up the length of a football field, then onto the red shed, committed a murder, got back before Tristan finished a drink of water. Now, feasible? That's what you have to decide. I believe, if my notes are correct, that I told you at the beginning of this trial, Amy Mullis was murdered. It wasn't an accident. And it doesn't take much to figure that out when you finally see the extent of her injuries. And I'm going to divert here a bit and try to touch base on some of the state's closing that you just heard. Started out with, Amy is scared of Todd, planning on leaving him. Todd is not telling the truth. Well, what the story we've heard is that apparently Amy fessed up to an affair about 5 years ago. And they went through some counseling. It wasn't easy, but they came to an understanding that she was going to leave the hospital, which was, as you heard, she had a party when she left. Not that she was dragged kicking and screaming out of there. That they were going to refocus their life. Amy was going to be a stay-at-home mom, a stay-at-home farmer. They were going to expand the hog operation to another barn. And that's what they did. And for the next 4.5, 5 years, Todd had no warnings. He had no signals. They were basically living the dream. But Amy, obviously at some point, wandered. The contact that she was having with Jerry Frazier led her into another affair. What's Amy going to tell her friends when they finally find out, or she tells them? Well, the reason I'm in an affair is because I'm afraid of Todd. I'm not happy with Todd. Amy's justifying her actions. She's telling her friends, he's a bad guy. He scares me. I'm not happy. What are we hearing from everybody else? And sometimes even from her. He's a good guy. He's a hard worker. He's a good dad. So, what's unhappy for Amy? At the same time, during those 4 to 5 years, and as you heard from Terry, she's golfing, she's lunching, she's taking boat trips, she's having fun with friends, she's on the volunteer of the Earlville Fire Department, tumbling, going on vacations. So is this a prisoner? Is this someone being controlled and dominated by Todd Mullis? I don't know about you, but it doesn't sound like that to me. She tells people, he'll kill me or I'll disappear. She's justifying what she's doing, and perhaps even in her own mind. And again, this is going to be jumping around here, and I'll try to get back to a more orderly presentation to you. Carrie Callan things are pretty tense around here. There was some tenseness around the Mullis house there in the last part of October, first part of November, because Todd's mom got upset because Todd was encountering a tough time. It was bad weather, field work wasn't getting done, and Amy was spending time with her uncle who had suffered this brain bleed, which there's nothing wrong with that. But 3 kids at home, bad weather, crops, and so forth, he complained. He complained to his mom, and I think he even complained to Terry about it. And his mom said something to her, and what did Todd do? Todd told his mom, "You're out of line. You shouldn't have said that to her." Then the state says, and again, I'm jumping, Todd isolated her in the shed that day. No one else there at the farm. Well, we talked at the beginning of this trial that we're not here, or at least I'm not here, to try to prove who murdered Amy Mullis. She was murdered, but the question is who. And if you want to speculate, look at the aerial photo of this farm. The main gravel road, main north-south gravel road, runs within a few feet of that shed. It's November 10th. Apparently it was warm enough that the day before, Todd's nephew was doing some field work, but too frozen to do that Saturday morning, which is what Todd had planned to do. So was his plan that day to do ripping, or I call it chisel plowing, or was it to kill his wife? Well, going back to this weather issue, the doors to this shed are frozen open. They won't close. Is it possible that somebody could have went in that shed and been in there and Amy surprised him? I know that sounds like a murder mystery, but could it? Whatever happened in there was sudden and violent. There's comments about he puts her in the pickup, he pulls the fork out of her back. Well, you shouldn't have done that. Everybody knows you shouldn't do that when someone has a puncture wound. He couldn't get her out the door with this dang thing sticking out of her body. What a horrible, horrible situation to be in. To lay her on the lap of his son, to call 911 and drive as fast as he could trying to get help, telling the 911 operator, "I can get closer." No, stop. Let the ambulance come. Now, late this morning, but actually at the very end of Todd's testimony, we hear this repeat of the 911 call. And the words I wrote down that the state says he was saying, and he was whispering into the 911 call as he was doing CPR on Amy, was cheating whore and go to hell cheating whore. If you listen carefully, and it may be very difficult with that type of equipment, but if you listen carefully, he's out of breath. He's doing compressions. He says, "She's cold, she's cold." And he tells Thompson that as soon as Thompson steps up, "She's cold." Who? It just boggles the mind that you would be on 911 saying that. If you murdered your wife and you're whispering, "Cheat her, go to hell," you're going to do it on a 911 call? She's not saying that. And if you have trouble hearing it, you're going to have to let the court know. But she's cold, and he's panting. She's cold. Listen, that is a Hail Mary by the state here, folks. And I'm going to get back to this a little bit more, but he's criticized because he thought it was an accident. And he told everybody at first that's what it was. The Google searches. If you look, and there's a lot of them. Defendant's Exhibit NO is, there's 2,945 entries on NO. And some of them are exactly what the state says. Cheating people, Aztecs, and I don't know all the particular terms. But who's engaged in activity that would make someone think, I wonder what's on the internet about this, other than the person who's cheating? And we don't know how long Amy cheated. Now, Jerry Fraser said with him anyway, it was from maybe late May, he thought June of last year. But who was the person 5 years ago that cheated? Amy. Who would be concerned about those topics? Now, I know what the state is trying to do. It's like, well, Todd's going to go in there and he's going to search because he's suspicious and he's going to plan, he's going to do these things. I think the other way around makes more sense. And of course, the state has to discount what Tristan says. Doesn't want to lose his dad. Said he's with his dad the whole time, and then there's that change of timing that I talked about a few minutes ago. You saw Tristan. Pretty solid kid. And he said the same thing from the get-go. Now, if I was to describe yesterday here in this courtroom, if someone says, were you with Christy all day long? I'd say, yeah. Did I go out in the hall and go to the bathroom? Did I go down to the pop machine and get a pop? Sure. But I was with her all day long. That's what Tristan said. I was with him the whole time. Well, he was with him the whole time. They were in the barn together. Were they eyeball to eyeball? A couple times, no, apparently. And Tristan told you about that. I'm sure he does feel pressure. But is he not telling the truth? Is he covering for his dad? Did he make that up that quickly? That by the time they got to well, he didn't even go to the hospital. He went back with Michael Krogman and told the two deputies what had happened, that him and Todd were in the barn. Amazing for him to come up with that and stick with it for so long.
There's no testimony to his statement at that time, Judge.
Go ahead, proceed, Mr. Firehelm.
Thank you. Witnesses Thompson and Cruz, the doctors. No problem with those. They did their jobs. They explained things to you. Amy was murdered. Dr. Thompson figured out that it wasn't an accident. He found more holes, and then they started to investigate. More puncture wounds. The state goes through, and I'm just too old to try to learn it. I don't have a PowerPoint, so just please listen to me as closely as you can. Those elements of malice aforethought and all of those things, you only have to get there if you think Todd did anything. Those are complicated instructions, and they have all this terminology. If you don't think Todd Mullis committed this act, then you don't have to try to analyze all that stuff. Things with, she mentioned the interview with the DCI agent that was here yesterday. He's trained, he's experienced, and he wouldn't let Todd say a word. He'd ask a question, but he wouldn't let him answer. And his analysis that, well, he should have just said, I didn't do it. He should have been more emotional about it or whatever. Todd's comment was, you're asking me to admit to something I didn't do. What's clearer than that? Especially when you walk into the room thinking that perhaps this is still an accident. And they made a big deal out of making that clear, that up until that point, until this agent says, we got the facts, we might even have some audio of you fighting in the kitchen that morning. We got it out of the cloud, which was a lie.
Objection.
Go ahead, Mr. Firehome.
What that agent wanted from the get-go is he felt he was clever enough to get Todd to admit that he did something, and he would have had to get him to admit to something he didn't do, and Todd just wasn't going to do it. And you could see how many times he circled around and came back and tried to get him to say it. Todd's criticized by the state for becoming super dad. What the heck else was he going to do when she's gone for almost half the time through September and October? And I'm not criticizing her for being gone for love of family. And obviously this came up unexpectedly. If he had an aneurysm or a brain bleed, there's no warning on that. But to now say, well, this is part of a plan. He was going to be super dad. It's grasping. On November 10th, 2018, in Delaware County, Iowa, Amy Mullis was viciously and deliberately murdered. Your job is to listen to the facts, the evidence, look at the exhibits, and decide what? Who did it? Partially. But the only part that you have to decide is if Todd Mullis did it. Because certainly she was murdered. The evidence that you've heard, both from the state and from the defendant, is that morning Todd and Tristan went to the other farm for chores to see if conditions would allow for further field work. They didn't. Back home, a bite to eat. Amy's doing a puzzle. She had had this medical procedure done a few days earlier on the 6th of November. And the plan, which had already been discussed between Todd and Tristan, was to go out to the hog barns and get ready for a delivery of pigs, the small pigs. That was their job, was to raise them up to butcher weight. Amy wants to join. Todd says she had been in the house due to that medical procedure, was getting kind of antsy and wanted to do something. So him and Tristan go out. She follows. They each take on a task, and number J, please. There's the barn that they went to. That loading chute door in the center, and to the very right, as you're looking at it, is that service door going into the office area. So that's where they went. Aye, please. There's that service door that you saw open in the first photo, and that's looking out from inside the office. And I believe Todd explained that as we're looking at this photo, that window to the right would be looking up towards the house and the shop. The window to the left is looking out into the main part of the hog barns. you go to Q, please? We were told that those are those heaters that Tristan was retrieving from that storage area and hauling out to the pens where they would be installed in anticipation of these small hogs, piglets, I guess. Triple R, please. I believe Todd explained that this is looking the other direction from the service door. Now the window on the left is towards the house and the shop. The window on the right is out into the hog barns. And you see straight ahead the door that goes out to where to the left would be the loading chute, and to the right would be the door that looks down that long hallway, which we'll see here in a second. X, please. Todd explained that that's the shot looking through that window on the south side, I think I got my directions right, of the office, which looks out into that hog area where they were working, getting things ready. T, please. Here you can see kind of a combination. To the right is the office, where we've seen the earlier photos, but now you can see down the long walkway to the other end of the barn. Could you go to N, please? N as in Nancy. There's a good layout of just how large this massive building is, and that long walk to the far end where there is another service door. And it's in there where they're taking these heaters and those nipple pipes that water things that Todd described, and as you can see, the light globes that Amy was cleaning. Standing on a pail sometime, or always. Q, please. I believe it's correct that if you would have gone the full length of the building, gone out that back service door, and now we're headed back towards the red shed, the shop, that area, that's what you'd see. That's how far you'd have to travel on foot to get up there. The red shed is just beyond that tree, and just to the left of the steel grain bins. O, please. The water hose is in the office where Tristan got a drink of water, just a few feet away from the doorway that we just looked through. W. They look out of the north window of the office area in the barn to the shop, and there's the garage on the end of the house. The area where Todd explained where he expected to see the pet carrier that Amy had gone to retrieve. Lastly, AA, please. And I believe Todd described this as you'd be standing very close to that service door going into the office and looking over towards the red shed. You can see the opening where the door is now wide open. So that's where we're at, the three of them, each doing their individual chores. But at some point, both Tristan and Todd some unsteadiness on Amy. They obviously are aware that she recently had this medical procedure. Terry Stanner told you about how it was. But she also, remember what Terry said? She went back to work that day. So depending on what Amy's physical health was, because of maybe excessive bleeding and so forth that was described, we just don't know. Other than she'd been taking it easy for several days. Todd says to her, take it easy, go to the house. A couple different times, he and Tristan observed this unsteadiness. Finally, if you want to help, go get the pet carrier from the shed and put it up by the shop. And we know why. The kittens don't get run over, so forth. And that they had planned to get a water tank out of there with some motor vehicle, a skid steer or four-wheeler or something. So Todd and Tristan continued to work for an hour, perhaps, maybe longer. And finally, when they looked out that window that I just showed you towards the shop, there was no pet carrier, and Tristan went to see whether she couldn't get it out or had gone to the house and just didn't try or whatever. And then the horrible, horrible events are discovered. I've talked about it, getting put in the pickup, the 911 call, how Todd tries to see if she's alive or if she's breathing, responding. She's not. They meet, the 911 call we've talked about, and that he's not whispering terrible things at the end of it. Todd goes on to the hospital. Tristan goes back to the farm. Tristan tells his story. At the hospital, at the school, he's interviewed several times consistently, other than the differences about this time and being eyeball to eyeball. A difference that I say is not significant here at all. Where did this investigation go off the tracks? I would place that point when Todd said in the 911 call, she fell on the fork. At that point in time, he had no other explanation. He didn't believe it to be a brutal assault. The only thing he could think of, she had been dizzy and she's got a fork in her back. She must have fell trying to get this pet carrier out. Now you can second guess and Monday morning quarterback that thing, but now we know a lot more. We know a lot more. She had the medical issues. She had the medical procedure 4 days earlier. She had been taking it easy. She wanted to get out of the house, and she had balance issues in the barn. Was it so unreasonable for him in that moment of panic on a 911 call when he's being asked what happened? She fell on this fork, and you can hear it. Was he to assume she had been murdered? What sense would that make? As the state says, it doesn't make sense. And I agree it doesn't make sense. But that doesn't make sense doesn't equate to Todd Mullis being guilty of first-degree murder. It was based on what he knew at the moment, at a moment of extreme emotional stress. He didn't know there was more than 4 puncture wounds. You saw all the clothes that came off. Even the medical people didn't know it until they really examined her, that there were more than 4 puncture wounds. Todd didn't know that, or Tristan either, really. As soon as the medical professionals informed law enforcement that an accident was not, that it didn't appear to be an accident, and Todd's explanation didn't match up, he now becomes the only suspect. And as the agent said yesterday, we gather evidence that fits our theory. We gather evidence that points towards our suspect.
Objection, mischaracterizes the testimony.
Go ahead, counsel.
We heard from Deputy Himseth. I hope I say that's wrong, and I'm not trying to butcher it. He came in, and he was talking about what he did, search warrants, interviews, and when we talked about the iPad, he told you, those were all done by Todd. I said, you sure? All done by Todd. Well, we know that's not true anymore. Unless Todd's on the internet looking for wedding dresses and diamond rings and tattoos that we know that Amy was planning on getting. All of them, according to him, they have to be. And when I ask him about diamond rings and wedding dresses, he says, well, he must have been looking for them. So that's...
Objection, mischaracterizes the testimony.
The physical evidence, the CSI type stuff. There's not much here, hardly any. The rake handle, I agree with the state. Wooden handle, and even if it had fingerprints on it, it's going to have Todd's on it because he pulled it out of his wife's pack. Understandable. The pathology done by Dr. Cruz, clearly a murder. No other physical or scientific evidence. But wait a second. The state brought out that Dr. Cruz clipped her fingernails and put them in a bag, but they were never examined. Never examined, even though Dr. Cruz said that she suffered from defensive injuries to her hands. She had injuries to the front, to the jaw, that someone attacked her from the front. And if you're batting off attacks, your hands are out, your fingers are out, your fingernails are out. But that wasn't examined, that wasn't followed up on by the state, because it didn't fit their theory. I believe the agent, I'll try to be accurate, says scientific tests like that, it's not driven by the facts of the case. That's what he said, not driven by the facts of the case. Well, if someone's suffering defensive wounds and batting off their attacker, isn't that driving this thing? Wouldn't that drive an investigation into those fingernails to see if someone's DNA is there? Someone other than Todd Mullis's? I would argue that it would appear that if it's going to undermine the theory of the case, just don't do it. Only one suspect. I also believe, and again, I'll try to be accurate, that the photographs of her hands is that there was no damage done to her nails. Well, if you've ever worked on a car or worked in the garden, can you get dirt under your fingernails or grease under your fingernails without injuring them? They took lots of photographs, apparently, of Todd's body, face, hands, back, feet, all of it. Any injuries? None. I believe, I don't know if it was the DCI agent or the deputy, that in ruling out Frazier as a suspect in this case, they did a self-tower search in his area of his home near Anamosa. No cell phone tower search around the Mullis farm. If someone, the murderer, was using a phone, had one, might have showed up on the cell phone tower. I have a page of all the witnesses: Deborah Shearbring, Jeff Fuller, Eileen Fuller, Angie Burr, Terry Stanner, the MEs, Thompson and Cruz, Patricia Christofferson. They told you about things that Amy said, things that they heard her say when they were around her. Like Patricia Christofferson was very much aware that Amy was having an affair. She was listening to Amy. Her knowledge of Todd, I think she admitted, was down to 2 instances. I think maybe they were both at funerals, or anyway, very, very minimal. Jerry Frazier, I'm sure it was a wonderful day in court for him. He said Todd called about these text messages, concerned about the professional nature of the contacts between him and Amy. He said he gave him an explanation and he thought Todd accepted it. And the relationship with Todd continued to be as normal as could be, all the way up till the time of the murder, even though he and Amy continued to have their affair. Frazier may have a different idea, and I think maybe some of the text messages and comments that Amy made to her friends start to show that even she started to realize that this was not going to be happily ever after with Jerry Frazier, that he was backing away, and that she was telling friends, I need to do this for myself. Eileen Fuller talked about a conversation about Todd saying that, I believe that's when he said, I'm not going to lose my farm, 2 to 3 years after the first affair, so that'd make it a couple of years ago, approximately. So is that evidence that Todd was planning and plotting the murder on November 10th, 2018? Quite a distance. The deputies, you heard from them, pretty straightforward. And again, I would state to you that Amy's comments to her friends about trying to make Todd out to be a bad guy was an excuse for her unfaithful conduct, wanting to keep the friends, knowing that some of those friends liked Todd. Hardworking, good father, strong family man. Amy was just not satisfied. And again, after 4 to 5 years of what Todd perceived as being a normal, healthy family relationship, he's not, other than this little hiccup with Frazier and the text messages, which he follows up on and he's satisfied with the explanation. What he doesn't know is that Terry Stainer goes to a medical conference and there's someone there that she hears, apparently, that there's rumors that Amy's up to it again. So Terry goes back and tells Amy, that's the day that generated that crazy phone call to Deborah Shearbring, who didn't understand what in the world, other than she worked at the hospital and Amy was worried about rumors. Amy probably does the right thing. She talks to Todd. Todd says, okay, satisfied, and they go on. And then we go into that period where Amy's gone a lot. And maybe that had nothing to do with Jerry. We don't know for sure that there wasn't contact, but the health issues in the family. So September and October, other than her being gone, bad weather, farming, and Todd taking care of the family. That's what's going on up until November 10th. And that also in that 4 to 5 years of life, they changed their life in a positive way. They put in another barn, they bought more land, they had plans, even plans in that timber that Amy was afraid Todd would bury her in. That's where they were going to build a cabin to live in. And her interest in building a cabin there seemed to grow every time they visited it. The searches, all long before Amy's murder, if you look at the exhibit. And now it seems that the state is conceding that Amy did some, we don't know how many, but at least some of the searches, and she had access to that Google account that had Todd's name on it. The ones that the state seems to find most, a significant one anyway, the body organs on November 6th. Todd told you, Taylor was concerned, wanted to know more information, and together they looked up this information. The state seems to be asking you to believe that Todd was specifically looking for the areas in the body where these organs are at so he could aim this fork when he was swinging it wildly and hit them. It just doesn't seem plausible. On NO, on the very left column, there's a number, and it goes all the way to that 2900 thing I told you about. On August 29th, right around the time that Stainer was telling Amy there's rumors, there's a search about bipolar disorder. Now, could Todd have done that? Could Todd be concerned about Amy's rather erratic behavior that she seemed to be showing at times? Perhaps. The hunter safety, we talked about that. He said he searched for Frazier, trying to get his wife's phone number, how to contact her. I had a whole list of the ones that I was going to try to prove that Amy was on this thing. The hairstyles for wedding dresses, jewelry. Todd talked about the swimming, floating. Was this a plan to drown his wife, or was this something that he's doing with his kids? The Ohana tattoo, beer bread recipes. Domino's in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. The DNA thing we've talked about. Boys raised like pussies. Well, Todd talked about that him and Amy were both concerned that maybe their son was being pushed around, money taken away from him. If you look at, that was at entry number 2725, that numbering system. At 2726, there's a Research of Psychology Today, a very legitimate psychological magazine. So sometimes if you look around those searches, you'll see very legitimate connections to a real legitimate reason to be making those searches. Just a couple other witnesses. Michael Krogman, of course, talked about taking Tristan back to the farm, told him to tell the truth. That's what he said yesterday. Tristan seemed upset, rightfully so. Mike Mullis talked about again, although it doesn't appear necessary now, that other people had access to that iPad. But he also talked about the security cameras, which Todd confirmed in his own testimony, that if you knock the antennas out of the windows, there is no recording. And that's how they found them the day after Amy's murder. Common sense, the state says, is one of the tools that you have here today, and I wholeheartedly agree with that. Common sense. Is that man diabolical enough to not only murder his wife with that thing, but to send his 13-year-old kid to find her? Is that guy, did he do that? Does he present that type of horrible, horrible evil? You saw him. You get to judge him. Is there reasonable doubt? Jury instruction number 10. I said at the end of my opening statement, there isn't just reasonable doubt. There's no doubt. Who did it? I don't know. I have no one to suggest other than what I talked to you about here before. The state's case is that used car with new tires and a paint job. They're asking you to take it and buy it, but don't test drive it. Don't start it up. Don't take it for a drive. Start the engine, do the test, and what you'll find is that the state has not proven a case against Todd Mullis beyond a reasonable doubt. And as I stated, the dots don't even remotely connect here. Do justice. Find this man not guilty.
Ms. Hughes, whenever you're ready.
I bet it took you just a few minutes to realize that this wasn't an accident. Amy's face down, on her hands and knees, raking her back, 6 puncture wounds. For the defendant to continue to think that this is an accident is implausible. The reason he stuck with that story for 6 days was because this was his plan. Every little thing that he did points right to his guilt. The defense wants you to believe that Amy's a liar. You would think that Amy's on trial for her own murder. Amy's the liar, Amy's the bad person, Amy's the one that does Google searches. It's asinine. They want you to believe that Amy's friends are all lying, that she lied to them and they're coming in here and lying to you, that they're all making this up, that they just want the defendant to go down. Do you think they want the right person to be responsible for this murder? To accept responsibility? If all of these witnesses are lying, if this is this big conspiracy.
I think that is an incorrect statement of my argument. I didn't say those witnesses are lying.
Go ahead, counsel.
If this is some big conspiracy that the state has, that the police has against the defendant, wouldn't these witnesses have made it better? Wouldn't they have all came in here and said the exact same thing? No, because Amy was telling them different parts about what was going on with her life. That makes sense. She's telling her brother how she wants a divorce and how she's asking her brother to keep furniture for her. It makes sense she's not telling her brother about her affair. She's telling some of her friends about her affair, about what's going on in her relationship. She's talking about different things with different people, which we all do all the time. Amy wasn't lying. She wasn't making this up. Why would she make it up? There's no reason why she made it up, because she didn't want people to be mad she was having an affair. She was going around telling people she was having an affair. It's not like she needed to come up with some big excuse as to why. If the defendant really believed that this affair was over, then why did he text Terry Stainer, "Everyone is lying to me"? He wants you to believe that, just like he wanted John Turbett to believe it when he first didn't bring up Jerry Frazier at all. And the defense wants you to think that interview with John Turbett wasn't good. He didn't give him the opportunity to actually deny it. Again, what I say is not evidence. What this man says is not evidence. The only evidence in this case is what comes from this witness stand and these exhibits that you get to take back there with you. You are to determine what you believe from these witnesses and these evidence. Think when you look at that clip of the defendant. This is a man who for 6 days is grieving his wife. He's so upset. This horrible, tragic thing happened. He is told that somebody came onto his property and butchered his wife with this corn rake, and he doesn't react at all. You are allowed to consider his actions before and after this homicide. Who acts like that? It doesn't make sense. Let's talk about Tristan again. This poor kid who didn't want to be here, who didn't want to testify, whose mother was brutally attacked, who had to find her. And they're saying, well, just believe him, right? Believe him. There is one vital piece of information that keeps changing in Tristan's testimony, and it's the amount of time that he's away from Dad. That he's initially not away from him, then it's 1 minute and 40 seconds, and then it's I don't know. And why? That's vital because that information buries him. We have tons of other evidence, but that seals the deal. Tristan's story keeps changing because he's coming to terms with the truth. He's a 13-year-old kid that wants to go back to the way things were, but it's never going to be that way because his mother is dead. When you think about not only the Google searches, but when you think about the defendant's testimony, he admits what he can't deny and denies what he can't admit. There's certain things he has to admit, right? He thought this was an accident. He didn't remember about the cameras. There's lots of things, and I won't go over it because I know that you guys were paying attention and you remember the evidence. And everything he admits, he has an excuse for. Everything. Organs of the body, buoyancy, anything that's somewhat damning, he's going to admit. Then there's the ones that are really bad he just has to deny. He has to deny killing unfaithful women. He has to deny the ones about infidelity. He can't admit that. And again, they want you to believe that Amy is conducting those searches. I implore you to look through those Google searches. And yes, from the beginning, the state has conceded that Amy has done some searches on them. Does that mean she did those ones? No. Look at those searches. Look at the ones that we told you were relevant. Look at before and after, surrounding those and the exact times, not days before or hours before. Look at the ones within minutes, and you will see that it's the defendant looking for combines and other things. Now let's talk about this 911 call. Again, The defense told you what they believe it says, and I told you what I believe it says. But that's not for you, or it is for you to determine, not just to listen what we say. And again, I'm just going to ask you to please listen to it over and over. Listen to it as many times as you need. 6, 53, and 7. And determine for yourselves what it says. When you take that with all the other evidence, you know what the defendant's state of mind that was that day. And the defense wants you to think that because the 911 is recorded, that the defendant would never say anything like this. This is a man who's excited, right? And he is excited. He's excited because he has to pretend he's excited. He's also excited because he just carried out this murder. It doesn't matter whether he planned it or not. He's still under the excitement of what happened. He just took a corn rake and stabbed his wife with it. Now he's in part of the cover-up. If you listen to that 911 tape, you can determine for yourselves what he says at those periods, and you will see that it just is another piece of evidence. This is not a Hail Mary. We don't need that 911 call. We don't need it. We don't need any part of that 911 call. It's just another piece of evidence that adds to everything else. Now, the defendant wants you to think that this is a whodunit, right? They talked a little bit about DNA and CSI and all that stuff. And what Agent John Turbett told you, it wasn't what the defense summarized his statement. It was that they follow the evidence. The evidence from day one has pointed at the defendant. But they did a 3.5-month investigation, interviewing 50 people. 19 search warrants. This wasn't a let's hurry up and arrest him. They did a thorough investigation. And every piece of evidence, every one that kept coming in, pointed straight to the defendant, proving more and more what he did. And just ask yourselves, because as we've been talking about, the common sense, right? Use your common sense. Did maybe the defendant not call 911 was because he wanted to get Amy in the car? He wanted a reason to touch this rake? As we talked about in jury selection, who is the one that determines the crime scene? Who determines the witnesses? Who determines what evidence to leave? The defendant does. He's the one that decides to commit that crime at that moment, around the people that he does, and leave what evidence he does. Think about that. This was a cold and calculated plan. It was planned for months and months. And even on that day, the defendant had a plan. It's not that this all just happened. The investigation never went off track. When you do listen to the 911 call, and the defendant talks about Amy falling on the corn rake, that's another piece of evidence for you to consider when you look at everything. If as a person, if you find a loved one impaled with a corn rake, the fact that you're just going to jump to the conclusion that they fell on it, again, it just shows that he's telling this story from the beginning. The fingernail clippings, this suspect who's just out there roaming the streets. Oh my goodness, Delaware County must be such a horrible, it's in danger right now because there's somebody out there that committed this murder. No, John Turbett told you why there was no finger clippings. There was no analysis done on them. The defense can get up here all they want and try to tell you that there's injuries around her fingernails, but that's not what the evidence shows. John Turbett told you that her fingernails, according to the Emmy report, were short and intact. And look at those pictures of Amy's hands from both Dr. Thompson and Dr. Cruz. There is injuries on the top of her hands. There is none near her fingernails. There is no evidence that she scratched anybody or that happened. There's also no evidence that somebody attacked her from the front, like the defense said in their closing. There's evidence that she has injuries there. Unfortunately, we don't know what happened that day inside that shed. You know who knows? The defendant, because he was there that day in that shed with Amy, and he made sure the only other person that would be able to tell us isn't here. She's dead because of what he did. We do not need fingernail clippings to convict the defendant. Look through those jury instructions, every single page. Nowhere does it say we need DNA evidence. Nowhere does it say the state has to have fingernail clippings. We need to prove the elements that I went over with you in my opening closing, and that is what we have done here. The defense wants you to believe that this whole second affair thing is put to bed. It's over. That everything is going great. And I don't want to belabor this again because I know that you guys have gone over this. But Jerry Frazier tells you he's still communicating with Amy. He testified that up until when they started that Gmail account, until her death, the date of her death, they are communicating between 15 and 40 times a day. Jerry Frazier tells you himself, days before her procedure, they meet and she performs oral sex on him. This affair wasn't over, and the defendant wants you to believe it was because he was planning this. Because this all along was his plan. We know it was his plan from the Google searches. This is something he's been thinking about for a long time. And things aren't that, coupled with what's going on in September and October, the defendant is still trying to pretend like their marriage is perfect. It's great, nothing's going on. She's in Ankeny for half of the time, but he's such a loving husband, he doesn't mind. It's ridiculous for you to believe that. The defense argued that who would send their 13-year-old to go and find their mother? You know who would do that? Somebody who's been planning and plotting to kill their mother. Somebody that had decided to do this. Somebody who had been planning it, looking it up on Google. Somebody who had been looking at all the different ways to do this. That was the significance of the other Google searches, to show you. He can have an excuse for it all he wants, but when you look at it in light of all the other evidence, you know he was trying to figure out, how am I going to do this? And he had to make it look like an accident, right? Let's be honest. He had to at first, hoping that it would work. He couldn't do something out of the ordinary. And what would be something that would maybe seem plausible, maybe if he carried it out the right way, didn't strike her twice, a farm accident. Now, the defense wants you, I don't remember, he wants you to, something about a used car analogy, something about we don't want you to take it for a test drive, and we just want you to buy the car. Absolutely not. Take this car for a drive. Take out pieces of evidence, put it back in. Look at it. Look at one piece, look at other pieces. Most of this evidence on its own convicts the defendant. And then when you look at it all together, every single sign, every piece of evidence points in only one direction, one place, directly towards the defendant. The defendant wants you to believe what? That all of these things that you heard about, all of these pieces of evidence are just happenstance. He wants you to believe that it just so happens that Amy is planning on leaving the defendant. And not only is she planning on leaving the defendant, it just so happens at the same time she's planning on leaving the defendant, she's storing furniture at her brother's. And just so happens at the time that she's planning on leaving the defendant, storing furniture at his house, that she's telling other people about her having an affair and how she's afraid of the defendant. And it just so happens that at the same time when she's having an affair, when she's planning on leaving the defendant, just so happens that the defendant is communicating with Eileen Fuller and saying things about Amy being gone and how he's angry and he's sick of this. And it just so happens, right around this same time, right before it, when all of this is happening, that the defendant finds out about the affair, that he confronts Jerry and Amy about the affair. And it just so happens, when all of these other things are happening, that Todd and Tristan have a conversation. And remember that? Remember Tristan told you that at one point he comes home from school and mom's crying and he goes outside and dad says something about mom talking to some guy? So it just so happens when all of these other things, when she's planning on leaving Todd, when she's telling her friends how afraid she is, when he's finding out about the affair, he's telling Tristan, it just so happens when all of that is happening that Amy has a procedure. And it just so happens that days before her procedure, it just so happens that they look up, the defendant with Taylor looks up organs of the body and looks at this map, specifically of organs. Just so happens. And it just so happens that 4 days later, no one else is around. It's just them on the farm. It just so happens that it's Tristan, Todd, and Amy out in the barn. And it just so happens when all these other things are going on that Amy gets dizzy, really dizzy from this procedure 4 days ago. And it just so happens not once, but twice she gets dizzy, twice. And it just so happens at that point, not the defendant, because he doesn't want you to believe it was him now, it was Tristan. Tristan said, hey, maybe mom should go get that pet carrier. Just so happens when all these other things are going on, at that moment, they decide the thing that would be helpful for us, even though you're so dizzy, is go get this pet carrier for us in this narrow way, because you'll be fine. You're too dizzy to stay out here with us and to help us clean a light fixture, but you're not too dizzy to go get a pet carrier that's 15 pounds. And it just so happens, you would have to believe that it just so happens when all these other things are going on, there is some mystery attacker out waiting on the Mullis farm. Just happens to be there at the exact moment that Amy Mullis just so happens to go to a red shed. It just so happens that the mystery attacker sees a corn rake to use as a murder weapon. It just so happens when all these things are going on, and that nobody else is on the farm, even for that mystery attacker, because then nobody else can see him. And it just so happens that no one hears a thing. Not one word, nothing, sees anything, hears anything. So this mystery person, who clearly didn't even did they have a plan to go there and murder Amy without a weapon? Just so happens to be such a good murderer that nobody hears them and they leave absolutely no evidence. And it just so happens when all of this is going on, Todd and Tristan have a conversation about that pet carrier. And it just so happens that Todd sends Tristan to go look for it. Not back in the house to look for Amy. It just so happens. Not that he decides to go look for her. Not that he tells Tristan to go in the house and make sure mom's okay. It just so happens when all of this is going on that he sends his 13-year-old son to go look for Amy, or that pet carrier. And it just so happens when all of this is going on, the defendant runs to that shed and he doesn't call 911. And it just so happens that when all of this is going on, he chooses to just pick up Amy and pull that rake out. And it just so happens that he makes that 911 call. It just so happens with all of these other things that he says she fell on a corn rake. And it just so happens that he goes to the police station that day and he maintains that she fell on a corn rake and that he doesn't tell anybody about the cameras. It just so happens, according to his testimony, that he didn't even remember about the cameras. It just so happens. The next day is the first time he thinks about it, but he doesn't tell anybody about it. And it just so happens that those cameras weren't working because he thinks some cats got them. And it just so happens that the next day, the cameras come back on. And it just so happens, the Google searches, they just happen to be there when all this other stuff is going on. All of this other stuff that points right at him. It just so happens that somebody is using his Google account to search for infidelity and killing your cheating wife and all of those things. It just so happens. It just so happens that when he is told that this is an accident, that he has no response because he's so taken aback. It just so happens. You would have to believe that he is the most unluckiest man in the world. No, because that's not the truth. Because every single one of these things shows that he did this. Now, the defense told you in my opening, in his closing, that I'm gonna say that I proved to you that he did it. And I am here to prove that to you, and I have proved that to you. I have proved it by the witnesses, we've proved it by the testimony, we've proved it by everything you've heard in court. And absolutely, I told you in jury selection that we have the burden of proof. And it is a good and decent burden, and it is a burden that we embrace. It is a burden that is met every day in criminal courtrooms. It is beyond a reasonable doubt. It is not beyond all doubt. It is not beyond a shadow of a doubt. It is not beyond a scintilla of a doubt. It is beyond a reasonable doubt. And clearly, we have proven the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree beyond a reasonable doubt. And I'm not asking you to find the defendant guilty just because I want you to. It's because the law dictates it. All of the evidence supports it, and justice demands it. Find the defendant guilty.
Okay, folks, turn your instructions back to number 27 and we'll read the last few. Instruction number 27, during the trial, you've been allowed to take notes. You may take these with you to the jury room to use in your deliberations. Remember, these are notes and not evidence. Generally, they reflect the recollection or impressions of the evidence as viewed by the person taking them and may be inaccurate or incomplete. Upon reaching a verdict, leave the notes in the jury room and they will be destroyed. Instruction number 28. During your deliberations, you must not communicate with or provide any information to anyone by any means about this case. You may not use any electronic device or media, such as a telephone, cell phone, smartphone, iPhone, BlackBerry, or computer, the internet, any internet service, or any text or instant messaging service, or any internet chat room, blog, or website, such as Facebook, YouTube, Snapchat, Instagram, or Twitter, to communicate to anyone any information about this case, or to conduct any research about this case until I accept your verdict. Your cell phones must be turned off during deliberations. If the length of deliberation causes you to need to make a call regarding personal arrangements, such as child care or other scheduling issues, you may make such calls when the jury takes a break and temporarily stops deliberations, but you must not discuss the case until after you've reached your verdict and I've released you from jury duty. Instruction number 29, when you begin your deliberations, you should select a foreman or forewoman. He or she shall see that your deliberations are carried on in an orderly manner, that the issues are fully and freely discussed, and that every juror is given an opportunity to express his or her views. In order to return a verdict, each juror must agree to it. Your verdict must be unanimous. It is your duty as jurors to consult with one another and reach an agreement if you can do so without compromising your individual judgment. Each of you must decide the case for yourself, but do so only after an impartial consideration of the evidence with the other jurors. During your deliberations, do not hesitate to re-examine your view and change your opinion if convinced it is wrong, but do not change your opinion as to the weight or effect of the evidence just because it is the opinion of the other jurors or for the mere purpose of returning a verdict. Remember, you are judges of the facts. Your sole duty is to find the truth and do justice. Instruction number 30, I am giving you one verdict form. You will find only one verdict. When you have agreed upon a unanimous verdict and the foreperson has signed the verdict form, please notify the court attendant. Signed at 2 p.m. this 20th day of September 2019. Okay, just a couple other small pieces of information before we send you out to start your deliberations. Occasionally during the deliberation process, the jury may have a question. If you have a question, you have to reduce your question to writing. It needs to be signed by your foreperson and given to the court attendant. The court attendant will bring the question to me. I'm required to inform the parties of the question, and we have to make a record about your question and the proposed response to you. You need to understand that words not specifically defined in the jury instructions should be given their ordinary meaning. I cannot comment to you about the evidence. You will receive no additional evidence. After I've talked with the attorneys, taken the time to make a record, we will get back to you with a written response. Typically that takes some time, some delay. You should bring any written questions you have and the written responses you receive from me together with the verdict form into the courtroom when you've reached a verdict. All of you must be together when you deliberate in this case. If anyone steps out of the jury room to use the restroom, make a phone call, smoke a cigarette, whatever it may be, discussion about this case has to stop. You can only discuss this case in any capacity when all of you are together. The instructions talk about your cell phones being turned off. The court attendant will actually keep all of your cell phones and electronic devices. If you need to use your phone for some reason, you can ask the court attendant and she'll allow you to take a break and use your phones. Remember, you still can't use them to communicate with anyone about this case or to do anything to acquire any information about this case. Last thing is, there are 14 of you, only 12 of you get to deliberate. We have a jury of 12, 2 of you are alternates in case during this trial someone became ill or had an emergency. Mr. and Ms. will be the 2 alternates. The 2 of them cannot speak with the rest of you in any way about this case, their thoughts, their feelings, anything. When I excuse you very shortly here, all 14 of you will go to the jury room and Mr. and Ms. will collect any possessions they have, give the court attendant a cell phone number for them, and then they are excused and free to leave. The 2 of them remain under the admonition. You cannot talk to anyone about the case, shouldn't draw any conclusions, and you cannot do anything to acquire any information about the case. If one of these jurors becomes ill or has an emergency, one of you may be called in to take their place. When the jury has reached a verdict, the court attendant or I will call both of the alternates and let you know what the verdict was, and at that time release you from the admonition. Okay, throughout trial I've been telling you you can't discuss the case with anyone, including each other. Now obviously is the point where the 12 of you are going to start discussing the case with each other. I have the verdict form and I'm going to give this to the court attendant, and she will at this time take you back into the jury room to start your deliberations.